How do you silently give opportunities to players to come to terms with an entirely new, genre-defining, perspective-changing mechanic, all while simultaneously teaching them how the combat in this game works? The answer is the inside of the Great Deku Tree, the first dungeon in Ocarina of Time. Hi, I am your host Alex. Let's take a deep dive into the very first fully 3D dungeon of the Zelda franchise. In a previous video, we explore how Kokiri Forest and the opening hours of Ocarina of Time seem carefully designed to help players come to terms with 3D movement, a concept that was, at the time, very new and could not be assumed as part of common game literacy. When I dropped off the topic, Link was entering the very first dungeon of the game, but there's one big mechanic that I had barely mentioned in all of Kokiri Forest, what was called at the time C targeting. While working on Super Mario 64, Nintendo developers quickly ran into an unforeseen issue. While jumping on top of an enemy is a straightforward process on a 2D platform, the lack of proper depth perception raises the skill floor to do this on 3D. The solution at the time was allowing Mario to punch and kick, a solution that interestingly, as the series progressed, either evolved into an easier to predict being attacked or got replaced almost entirely by something else. Both examples being things that work way better with a free camera. When it came time for the first 3D Zelda game, it was evident that a full solution was needed to fight individual enemies, and the solution came from a samurai show in the Toei Kyoto Studio Park. When one of the ninjas locked the samurai with a sickle and chain and started moving in circles around him, inspiration struck the Zelda team. C-targeting is essentially an invisible chain between Link, the camera, and a target object, changing the relative point of rotation from the camera to the target. This has been widely adopted in sword-wielding action-adventure games to the point that it has likely become second nature for you. And for good reason. It's a genius mechanic that makes it straightforward to fight small groups of enemies. It is, however, not extremely intuitive on how it's supposed to work, and Kokiri Forest only offers new players a taste of what this mechanic is and does. There's a girl on top of the shop that tells you to talk to her, which does at least provide some initiation of the idea of targeting. But there is no real tutorial to get intuitively acquainted with the idea of moving while targeting. Most of the important parts are buried under layers of heavy immersion breaking explicit tutorial text, and some of the objects provided for practice are objects that have entirely different purposes on other areas of the same forest, adding to player confusion regarding what can they do. Thankfully, going into the first dungeon, the design of the game is aware of that and provides a carefully crafted progression of enemies especially designed not only for players to get comfortable with the idea of C-targeting, but also silently teaching the basic principles of most fights on this game. Using the sword while not targeting causes an horizontal slash, which gives people who have trouble with C-targeting a tool that is somewhat similar to what they had in previous 2D Zelda games. Then a vertical slice when targeting, which fulfills the purpose of a very targeted sword attack, as well as a bunch of other advanced moves which are not super important because it will literally take a revolution in control methods for the direction of your attacks to matter in a Zelda game many years later. For almost every fight in Ocarina of Time, the thing players need to keep track of is distance and timing. Distance to keep a perfect range from the enemies, and timing to know when to use the shield and when to exploit an enemy opening. Let's start with distance. The very first enemy Link encounters is a Deku Baba. Players had already encountered a weaker version of this enemy on the road to the dungeon that is a little bit more than grass that hurts if you get too close. But the full thing is way more interesting on its design. As previously mentioned when I explained the inspiration for the mechanic, when you C-target an enemy, what you essentially do is anchor yourself to an object, and then all movements becomes a circle. Pressing to the side of the analog stick makes you go around the circle, and pressing forward and backwards changes the radius of the circle, and therefore your distance to the target. It is then super appropriate that the Deku Baba is an enemy stuck in a non-moving point that can only hurt you in a circle around the center. Get too close and you get hurt. Get too far and you ain't killing it. There's a Goldilocks zone of swords where it cannot hurt you and you can just reach it with your sword. Sometimes the Deku Baba will take the first hit and do it all again. Sometimes he gets stunned and you will have to run to the center and cut it. Either way, the Deku Baba exists for players to practice the first element of Ocarina of Time combat with a static, non-moving target. It is not a surprise that when you keep moving through the somewhat linear path of this dungeon, you run into this guy, the good old Deku Scrub. The Deku Scrub is an enemy that is also static, but can spit nuts at the player that cause damage, essentially making their range another circle, just when having a much larger hurt zone. If the player tries to apply the same logic as the Deku Baba, the Scrub just hides under flowers, so there's no magical Goldilocks zone for you this time. And since it uses ranged attacks, getting far away from it is not going to help avoiding the attacks either. The Deku Scrub exists to teach player a lesson in shielding. The way to defeat a Deku Scrub is to bounce their bullets right back at them. While it is possible to angle this manually, this is a breeze if you're targeting them. The lesson here is clear. The effective way of shielding against an enemy is to keep them targeted, all while reinforcing lessons about distance control. So far, players have practiced movement, spacing, and shielding with a static target, but there's one last piece of the puzzle missing: timing. For a lot of 3D action-adventure games, combat comes down to timing. There's a time to wait, there's a time to defend, and there's a time when your enemy drops their defenses and you attack. Timing is the meat of almost every fight in 3D Zelda games until Skyward Sword. So it is not a surprise that after getting the slingshot and climbing to the second floor, the player meets the Skulltula, a spider that is once again a static enemy that can only hurt you if you get close enough. The Skulltula is a Deku Baba, once again testing that you're in the right distance to cause damage, but not close enough to get hurt. But this time the mechanic comes with a spin, literally. The Skulltula has a hard front and a soft, vulnerable underbelly, and it switches between both in a very obvious manner. It does not even make sense from a narrative perspective. Why is the spider showing you its underbelly? But the lesson here is super clear and obvious. In addition to keeping careful control of the distance, you also get to keep an eye on the window when the enemy is vulnerable. And just like that, the basics of fighting enemies with Z targeting are taught. These 3-ground enemies are basically the only ones that you find in this dungeon over and over again. I mean, I'm missing maybe the wall Skulltulas, and those only exist to teach player about the slingshot. Close to the end of the dungeon, there's a large circular room that hides an ugly secret. This eggs in the ceiling, which are pretty hidden unless you're looking really closely, and hatch John Gomas, the first enemy in the game that can move and actively chase Link. John Gomas are not very hard to kill, and unlike the Skulltula, they do not require any specific timing to hit. But they have a pretty nasty jump attack that is very clearly telegraphed, and they run away from the player when they receive damage, so they represent a more advanced lesson in both shield timing and distance. And more importantly, since they move around, they basically present an advanced test on a lot of the C targeting skills the player has been practicing, but now on something that actually gives chase. There are 3 of them in the ceiling, so chances are that the player is going to accidentally hatch more than once and get a nasty unexpected increase in difficulty in the middle of a fight. Spacing, the timing for shielding, and the timing for attacking. These are all the principal skills a player will need to fight almost everything from the boss of a dungeon to like almost every enemy until Skyward Sword. And this very careful selection of enemies easily glides the player into intuitively understanding this. Going out into the world after this dungeon, the player has all the components they need to tackle all future challenges. So what do you think? Did you notice any of these elements when you originally played this game? Let me know in comments.